I prayed again, but this time something felt different. Not because my situation had changed, not because money suddenly appeared, and not because the pressure disappeared overnight. Everything outside was exactly the same. But something inside me finally shifted, and if you've ever been in debt, you know exactly what I mean when I say this goes far beyond money. Because debt is not just numbers on a screen or bills on a table. It's a constant weight on your chest. It's the silent anxiety that follows you everywhere. It's that moment late at night when everything is quiet, but your mind refuses to rest. Replaying every mistake, every decision, every moment that led you here. And in those moments, you pray, you really pray. You ask God to help you, to remove the burden, to open a door, to do something, anything, and for a moment, you feel peace. You feel like maybe this time things will change. But then the next day comes and reality hits again. The bills are still there, the pressure is still there. And slowly, without even realizing it, a question starts forming deep inside you. God, why again? Because this wasn't your first prayer. You've prayed before, you've believed before, you've asked for help before, and yet somehow, you're still in the same place. That cycle can break something inside you if you're not careful. It can make you feel like your prayers are not being heard, like your faith is not enough, like something is wrong with you. And that's exactly where I was, praying again, but feeling like I was repeating the same words, the same requests, expecting a different result. And that's when something unexpected happened. Not outside, inside, because for the first time, instead of asking God to remove my debt, I stopped and asked a different question. I said, God, why is this still in my life? And that question changed everything, because most people pray for outcomes, but very few ask for understanding. Most people want the problem gone, but they never ask why it keeps coming back. And the truth is, sometimes God is not trying to remove something immediately. Sometimes He is trying to reveal something first. Something deeper, something uncomfortable. Something that if you ignore it, will keep repeating in your life no matter how many times you pray. And that realization hit me harder than anything else, because I started to see that debt was not just a financial issue in my life. It was a pattern in how I thought about money, a pattern in how I made decisions, a pattern in how I responded to pressure, emotions, and opportunities. And I had been asking God to remove the consequence without ever confronting the pattern. And maybe that's where you are right now. Asking for relief, asking for a breakthrough, asking for a miracle, but avoiding the deeper truth because it's uncomfortable, because it requires change, because it forces you to look at yourself in a way you might not be ready for. But listen carefully. This is not about blame or guilt. This is about clarity, because the moment you see it, everything starts to shift. The way you think about money begins to change. The way you make decisions begins to change. The way you handle opportunities, pressure, and even fear begins to change. And suddenly, you're no longer just waiting for God to fix your life. You're allowing Him to transform you from the inside out. And that's when things begin to move. Not instantly, not magically, but differently. Because now, you're not just asking for a miracle, you're becoming someone who can actually sustain one. And that's something most people never talk about. They want the blessing, but they don't want the process. They want the result, but not the transformation required to keep it. And that's exactly why so many people get out of debt, only to fall right back into it again, because nothing inside them changed. And I realized something in that moment that I will never forget. I didn't want temporary relief anymore. I didn't want a quick solution that would fade in a few months. I wanted real freedom, the kind that doesn't disappear, the kind that doesn't depend on luck, timing, or external circumstances, the kind that comes from alignment. Alignment between what I believe, what I do, and what God is trying to teach me through every situation I face. And when I finally understood that, everything started to make sense. Not instantly, not perfectly, but clearly. And what I'm about to share with you is the exact shift that began to change everything for me. Not overnight, but permanently. And if you stay with me until the end, you might start seeing your situation in a completely different way too. Asterisk, and this is where everything began to change for me. Because what I'm about to tell you is something I wish someone had told me much earlier. Something simple, but powerful. Something that most people overlook because they are too focused on the outcome instead of the process, and it's this: God will not multiply what you refuse to manage. Read that again in your mind, because that sentence alone can change your entire life. God will not multiply what you refuse to manage. And I realized that I had been asking for increase. While ignoring responsibility, I was praying for more money. But I wasn't being faithful with what I already had. I was asking God to remove my debt, but I hadn't changed the habits that created it. And that was the hard truth I needed to face, because in the Bible, increase is always connected to stewardship. Always, not sometimes, not occasionally, always. And when I saw that pattern, everything started to make sense. Because it's not just about receiving. It's about being prepared to sustain what you receive. And let me ask you something honestly. If God gave you today everything you've been asking for, would your current habits be able to keep it? Or would you lose it again in a few months? That question hit me deeply, because the answer was not what I wanted it to be. And maybe right now, you're starting to feel the same thing. Maybe you're realizing that this is not just about waiting. This is about becoming. Becoming more disciplined, becoming more aware, becoming more aligned with the principles that actually create stability and growth. And listen, this is not about perfection. This is about direction. Because the moment you start moving in the right direction, everything begins to shift, even if it's slow at the beginning. And this is where I want you to do something very important. Something simple but powerful. If you truly want God to start working in your finances, I want you to write this in the comments right now. Don't overthink it, just write it. God, make me ready for what I'm asking for. Write it exactly like that. Because this is not just a comment, it's a declaration. It's a moment of honesty between you and God. It's you saying, I don't just want the blessing. I want the transformation, and there is something powerful about declaring that publicly. Because it breaks something inside you. It shifts your mindset from passive waiting to active alignment. And you'll be surprised how many people feel exactly like you. How many people are going through the same struggle silently. And when you write it, you're not just helping yourself. You're also encouraging someone else who needed to see that they're not alone. And as you do that, I want you to keep listening carefully. Because what I'm about to share next is the first practical shift I made that started to change everything. Not instantly, but consistently. And this is where most people either grow or stay stuck, because it requires action, not just emotion. And if you apply this, even in a small way, you will start to notice a difference in how you think, how you act, and eventually, in what you experience. And that first shift is this. I stopped seeing money as something to escape my problems, and I started seeing it as something to manage with purpose. Because before that, every decision I made was emotional. If I felt stressed, I spent. If I felt overwhelmed, I avoided. If I felt pressure, I looked for quick solutions instead of sustainable ones. And that pattern kept feeding the same cycle, again and again. But the moment I became aware of it, everything started to change, slowly but differently. Because now I was not reacting, I was choosing. And that is where real transformation begins. Not when everything around you changes, but when the way you respond to it changes. And this is where things became very real for me. Because once I understood that God was not going to multiply what I refused to manage, I had to confront something I had been avoiding for a long time. My daily habits, not the big decisions, not the obvious mistakes, but the small repeated actions that were shaping my financial reality without me even noticing it. Because most of the time, it's not one big error that keeps you stuck. It's a pattern of small decisions repeated over and over again. And the first habit I had to confront was something that many people struggle with: spending without intention. Not reckless spending, not something extreme, but unconscious spending. Money would come in, and without a clear plan, it would go out. I would pay what felt urgent, cover what felt necessary, and whatever was left would disappear without direction. And at the end of the month, I would ask myself the same question: where did it all go? And if you're honest, maybe you've asked yourself that same question before. Because when money has no assignment, it always finds a way to leave. And that was my reality. I was working for money. But my money was not working for me. Everything I earned was being consumed. Not directed, not multiplied, just used. And that pattern alone was enough to keep me in the same place, no matter how much I increased my income. Because without structure, more money does not solve the problem, it only expands it. And the second habit I had to confront was avoiding discomfort. Because I realized that I was staying in what felt safe, even if it was keeping me stuck. I avoided learning new things that could increase my income. I avoided taking opportunities that required growth. I avoided stepping into environments that challenged me. Not because I couldn't, but because it was uncomfortable. And that comfort was silently limiting my future. And maybe this is hitting you right now. Maybe you know there are things you could do that would change your situation. But you keep delaying them. You keep telling yourself you'll do it later. You keep choosing what feels easy instead of what creates growth. And that is one of the biggest silent blockers of increase. Because growth always lives outside of comfort, always. And the third habit that changed everything for me was moving from reaction to intention. Because before, I was living in reaction mode. Something happened and I reacted. An expense appeared and I reacted. A problem showed up and I reacted, and that kept me in survival mode. Always responding, never leading, always behind, never ahead. And the moment I decided to start planning instead of reacting, everything began to shift, because now my decisions had direction. Now my actions had purpose. Now my money had a role. And that alone began to break the cycle, slowly but consistently. And there is one more habit that I need you to hear carefully, because this one is deeper than the rest, and it's this: misalignment between what you say and what you do. Many people say they want change. They say they want freedom. They say they want growth. But their daily actions tell a completely different story. They keep making the same decisions. They keep repeating the same patterns. They keep choosing the same habits, and that creates a gap. A gap between desire and reality. And that gap is exactly where frustration lives. Because you cannot expect different results while maintaining the same behavior. And this is where I want you to do something again. Something simple but powerful. If you recognized yourself in any of these habits, I want you to write this in the comments. I see it now, just that. Because awareness is the first step to change. And the moment you say it, the moment you acknowledge it, you stop operating blindly. You stop repeating patterns without noticing. And you start becoming intentional, and that is where everything begins to shift. Because now you are not just hoping for change. You are positioning yourself for it, and if you stay with me, what I'm about to show you next is the shift that connects everything. The one that moves you from awareness into real transformation. Asterisk, and this is where everything began to connect for me. Because awareness alone is not enough if it does not lead to transformation. And transformation is not just about changing what you do. It is about changing who you are becoming in the process. Because at the end of the day, your results will always follow your identity, not just your intentions. And this is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They try to change their situation without changing themselves. They try to fix the outside while ignoring what is happening inside. And that is why the cycle keeps repeating. because nothing fundamental has actually shifted. And I had to face that truth in a way that was uncomfortable but necessary. I had to understand that if I wanted a different financial reality, I had to become a different person financially, not just temporarily, not just when I felt motivated, but consistently. And that required a shift in identity, a shift in how I saw myself. Because before that, I saw myself as someone trying to escape debt, someone trying to survive, someone trying to get out of a problem. But that mindset alone was keeping me trapped, because everything I did was reactive. Everything I did was focused on relief, not on growth. And the moment I changed that, everything started to move differently. Because I stopped asking, how do I get out of this? And I started asking, who do I need to become so this no longer controls me? And that question forced me to take responsibility in a way I had never done before. Because now the focus was not just on the situation, it was on me, on my discipline, on my consistency, on my decisions, on my habits, on my mindset. And that is where real power begins. Because when you change who you are becoming, your actions change naturally. Your decisions change naturally. Your standards change naturally. And your results begin to follow that shift. And this is where faith connects with action. Because many people think faith is just believing, but real faith is alignment. It is acting in a way that reflects what you say you believe. It is making decisions that move you forward even when it feels uncomfortable. It is choosing discipline when emotion tells you to avoid it. And this is what I started to do. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently. I began to track what I was doing. I began to question my decisions. I began to stop acting on impulse. I began to think before spending, before reacting, before choosing. And slowly something began to change, not just in my finances but in my mindset. I felt more in control, more aware, more intentional. And that feeling alone began to shift everything. Because now I was no longer reacting to life, I was directing it. And this is where many people never reach because it requires responsibility. It requires honesty. It requires letting go of excuses that feel comfortable but keep you stuck. And I know that is not easy, but it is necessary. Because the moment you stop blaming circumstances and start taking ownership, you take back control. And when you take back control, you open the door for real change. And as I continued in this process, I began to notice something else that was even more important. I began to see that discipline is not something you do once. It is something you build daily, in small decisions that seem insignificant at first, but become powerful over time. Because consistency creates results that intensity never can. And that is where many people fail. They try hard for a few days. They feel motivated for a short time, but they do not sustain it long enough to see real change. And that is why their situation never truly shifts. But when you stay consistent, even when you do not feel like it, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it seems like nothing is happening, that is when the real transformation is taking place. And that is when your identity begins to solidify. Because now you are no longer acting based on emotion. You are acting based on intention, and that is what creates long-term results. And this is where I want you to do something again, something simple but powerful. If you are ready to stop repeating the same cycle and actually become someone different, not just temporarily but permanently, I want you to write this in the comments right now. I'm becoming different. Because that statement is not just words, it is a decision. It is you choosing to step into a new direction. It is you telling yourself and God that you are ready to align. And when you make that decision, everything begins to shift. Not instantly, but consistently. And that is what creates real change. And now you see it from a completely different perspective. Not just as information that sounds good for a moment, but as something real. Something that can truly change your life if you decide to apply it. Because this is not about hearing another motivational message and feeling inspired for a few minutes. This is about transformation. This is about realizing that your current situation is not permanent, but your current patterns will keep it that way if you refuse to confront them. And that is the difference between people who stay trapped in the same cycle for years and people who slowly begin to break free. It is not luck, it is not timing, it is not some mysterious external force. And it is not even just opportunity, it is alignment. It is becoming someone who can actually handle what they keep asking God for. It is building habits that support growth. It is making decisions that move you forward instead of quietly pulling you back. And that is what I want you to hold on to after this video. Not just a strong phrase, not just a good idea, but a direction. Because if you really apply what you heard today, even in a small way, you are going to begin noticing a shift. Maybe not immediately in your bank account, maybe not overnight in your circumstances, but definitely in your mindset, definitely in your awareness, definitely in your decisions. And that is where every real breakthrough begins. Because external change almost always starts with internal clarity. And the moment you begin to see clearly, you stop moving the same way. Because think about it, if your habits stay the same, if your reactions stay the same, if your mindset stays the same, if the way you handle pressure, money, opportunities, and fear stays the same, then why would your results suddenly become different? They wouldn't. And that is the uncomfortable truth that many people avoid. Because it is easier to hope for a miracle than it is to become the kind of person who can sustain one. It is easier to keep praying for change than it is to let God expose the habits, patterns, and beliefs that keep delaying it. But that is exactly why so many people stay stuck. They want relief without growth. They want increase without discipline. They want open doors without internal preparation. And that is not how lasting transformation works. Because anything that comes into your life without this structure to sustain it will eventually slip through your hands. And maybe that is exactly what God has been trying to protect you from. Not to punish you, not to ignore you, but to prepare you. Because sometimes what feels like delay is actually mercy. Sometimes what feels like silence is actually a process. And sometimes what feels like nothing is changing is exactly where the deepest changes are happening inside you. And when I finally understood that, I stopped seeing my situation as proof that God was withholding something from me. And I started seeing it as an invitation to become someone different. Someone more aware, someone more disciplined, someone more intentional, someone who no longer makes decisions emotionally and then asks God to fix the consequences. Someone who no longer calls chaos a season when it is really the result of repeated misalignment. And that shift changed everything, because now I was no longer living as a victim of my circumstances. I was becoming a steward of my direction, and there is a huge difference between those two ways of living, because one keeps you powerless, and the other reminds you that with God's help, with wisdom, with discipline, and with honesty, you can actually begin to rebuild what has felt broken for a long time. And maybe that is what you need to hear right now. Maybe you do not need another message telling you to just keep waiting. Maybe you need a message that tells you the truth. That tells you that real freedom begins when you stop repeating what is hurting you. When you stop protecting the habits that keep you small. When you stop calling survival normal. And when you finally decide that enough is enough. Because your life can change, your finances can change, your patterns can change, your future can change. But it will not happen just because you want it. It will happen when your decisions begin to align with the life you say you want. When your habits begin to support the freedom you keep praying for. When your daily actions start reflecting the person you are becoming instead of the version of you that has been operating from fear, exhaustion, confusion, and lack of direction. And this is why I need to say this clearly. You are not doomed to repeat the same cycle forever. You are not destined to remain trapped in the same financial pain, and you are not too late to change. But you do have to become honest. You do have to become intentional. And you do have to stop waiting for change while protecting the patterns that prevent it. Because once you align, everything starts to move differently, maybe not instantly. Maybe not dramatically at first, but genuinely. And over time that becomes powerful. And before you leave this video, I want you to pause for a second and really ask yourself, what is the one pattern I know I need to stop protecting? What is the one habit I keep excusing? What is the one area where I already know God has been trying to get my attention? Because that is the place where your transformation begins. Not in theory, not in inspiration, but in honesty. And there is something powerful about admitting it. There is something powerful about bringing it into the light. Because the moment you do that, it loses some of its power over you. And that is why I want you to do one last thing. If this message spoke to you, if you felt something shift inside you, if you realize that this is not just about debt, not just about money, but about who you are becoming, then write this in the comments right now. This changes everything. Write it exactly like that. Because that is not just a comment, it is a decision. It is a line in the sand. It is you saying, I refuse to stay asleep to this any longer. I refuse to keep living on autopilot. I refuse to keep asking for freedom while repeating the same patterns that keep me bound. And when you write it, you are not just expressing agreement. You are making a commitment, and I will be reading your comments. Because I want to know who is truly ready, who is truly serious, who is done surviving and ready to start aligning. And if that is you, then do not just leave this video feeling moved. Leave it decided. Leave it clear. Leave it committed, because once you align, once you become intentional, once you stop waiting passively and start moving differently, everything begins to change, and that is where real freedom begins. Not just financially, but internally too.